Imagine a city that has burned, rebuilt, revolted, and reinvented itself more times than almost any place on Earth. A city where kings dreamed of eternal power, where artists redefined beauty, and where ordinary citizens repeatedly challenged history. Paris is not just a beautiful capital filled with monuments and cafes. It is a living timeline of ambition and survival. Every street corner, every bridge, and every stone carries echoes of struggles and triumphs that shaped the modern world. And today, using advanced visual technology to bring old engravings and silent photographs to life, we watch that story unfold. From the quiet riverbanks where everything began to the dazzling skyline of the modern city, this is the story of Paris. Long before Paris became the City of Light, around 259 BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled on a small island. Today that island is called Île de la Cité, the heart of the city, but then it was simply a practical place to survive. The Parisii were fishermen and traders. The river provided food, transportation, and vital protection. Controlling the crossing point of the Seine meant controlling trade routes moving through the entire region. Their name likely meant boat people or skilled craftsmen, which tells us a lot about their everyday lives. They were not building cathedrals, they were building huts, catching fish, and trying to survive in a difficult world. That existence changed in 52 BC when one of history's most powerful figures arrived, Julius Caesar. The Roman legions marched into the region during the Gallic Wars. The Romans did not negotiate, they conquered. During the fighting, the settlement was burned to the ground as the local population resisted Roman control. But the Romans were famous builders, and destruction was only the beginning of a grand transformation. They rebuilt it in their own style and gave it a new name, Lutetia, which meant marshy place. It was not a glamorous name, but the Romans rarely cared about poetry when it came to administration. Under Roman rule, Lutetia grew into a proper town. Most of the development took place on the left bank. Over 3 centuries, the city adopted Roman culture. An amphitheater for 15,000 spectators was built. Public bathhouses, temples, and paved roads appeared. Aqueducts carried water into the city. Order replaced chaos. For Roman citizens, life could be quite comfortable. Markets operated regularly, and trade flowed along the river. Yet no empire lasts forever. By the 3rd century, the Roman world was beginning to fracture under pressure. Germanic tribes began raiding from the north, threatening settlements across the entire region. Residents responded by retreating to the safety of the island where the city had originally begun. The island was easier to defend. Walls were constructed. Fortifications rose along the riverbanks. The grand vision of the Roman Empire was fading, and Lutetia was preparing to become something entirely different. In 451 AD, a terrifying army led by Attila the Hun moved westward. Entire regions were devastated. When word spread that Attila was approaching, fear spread quickly. Many prepared to abandon the city. According to tradition, everything changed because of a young woman named Genevieve. She urged them to stay. Attila's army ultimately changed direction and did not attack. The population interpreted this as a miracle. Genevieve became Saint Genevieve, the protector of Paris, giving the settlement hope in a collapsing world. In 508 AD, Clovis I, the king of the Franks, chose Paris as his capital. This decision marked a turning point. The city officially took its name from the ancient Parisii. It was becoming the heart of a new kingdom. Clovis helped transform the city into an important religious center. Paris was no longer just an outpost. In 845 AD, Paris faced a new danger: Viking raiders. They targeted the city's wealth, sailing longships up the Seine for plunder. The worst attack came during the siege of 885. Defenders held the fortified bridges against thousands, teaching the city that survival required stronger defenses. By 1163, Paris was transforming. Construction began on Notre-Dame, a project that would take 2 centuries and push the limits of Gothic engineering. Nearby, the Latin Quarter emerged as a center of knowledge. Scholars from across Europe gathered to study, shaping the intellectual future of the continent. King Philip II paved the muddy streets and built the Louvre, not as a museum, but as a massive fortress to protect the growing city. By 1300, Paris was one of Europe's largest cities, a vibrant crossroads of commerce, faith, and power that would define its identity for centuries. Yet prosperity often attracts new dangers. As Paris became wealthier and more influential, it also became a political and military target. The 14th century would test the city in ways that nearly destroyed it entirely. The first disaster came in the form of famine. During the early 1300s, poor harvests across Europe caused severe food shortages. Crops failed repeatedly, and hunger spread. In Paris, prices for basic food soared while supplies shrank. Families struggled to survive as starvation weakened the population. Soon after, another crisis erupted. In 1337, England and France entered into a prolonged conflict known as the Hundred Years' War. It centered on disputes over who had the rightful claim to rule France. Paris found itself caught in the middle of this enormous struggle. Armies moved across the countryside, resources were drained by warfare, and political tensions intensified within the city itself. But even the violence of war could not compare to the horror that arrived in 1348. That year, the Black Death reached Paris. The plague was one of the deadliest pandemics in history. Within a short period, up to half of the city's population died. Daily life collapsed. Trade slowed and workshops closed. Families lost multiple members within days. The smell of death lingered. Those who survived witnessed the destruction of the social structures they relied on. Paris was left wounded and fragile. As if plague and war were not enough, social tensions soon erupted into rebellion. In 1358, the Jacquerie Uprising began. Anger over heavy taxation and exploitation by the nobility fueled the revolt, demonstrating how unstable the kingdom had become. Later in 1382, Paris exploded in the Maillotins revolt. Workers and citizens attacked symbols of royal authority. The government responded with harsh punishment, restoring order through force but leaving deep resentment among the people. By 1420, Paris fell under English control. For 16 years, the capital was ruled by foreign powers while the court retreated. But history was preparing a turning point. In Lorraine, a teenage peasant girl claimed divine voices instructed her to save France. She was only 17 and unknown, yet she carried an extraordinary conviction that the rightful heir must be crowned king. The uncrowned heir, the Dauphin, agreed to meet her. Desperation often opens the door to unlikely solutions. She accompanied French forces to Orléans in 1429. The city's fall would have ended any serious French resistance. Yet the young woman's presence had a surprising effect. Discouraged soldiers suddenly believed that victory might still be possible. Against expectations, the siege of Orléans was broken. French forces pushed back the English, marking one of the first major victories after years of defeat. The success electrified the country. Word spread quickly that the young visionary had helped inspire a turning point in the war. English soldiers reportedly feared her, believing she might possess supernatural power. Whether people believed her visions or simply needed hope, her influence was undeniable. Her campaign did not directly liberate Paris. Later in 1429, an attempt to retake the city failed, and she was wounded during the attack. But the psychological shift she created was powerful. French forces regained confidence, and the Dauphin traveled to the city of Reims where he was crowned King Charles VII. That ceremony restored legitimacy to the French monarchy and strengthened resistance against the English occupation. The young heroine's story, however, ended tragically. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces allied with England. They sold her to the English, who put her on trial for heresy. The charges were political as much as religious. If she could be discredited, the symbolic victory she represented might also disappear. After months of interrogation, she was condemned and burned at the stake in the city of Rouen in 1431. She was only 19 years old. Yet her death did not erase her impact. Her brief campaign had already shifted the momentum of the war. French resistance strengthened, and by 1436, Paris was finally liberated from English control. Although the Hundred Years' War would continue until 1453, the capital was once again under French authority. Still, the city had endured more than a century of warfare. Occupation, famine, and plague. By the end of the conflict, Paris was scarred and exhausted. As the 15th century closed and the 16th century began, the city slowly began recovering. Population numbers gradually increased again. Trade resumed. Royal authority strengthened as the monarchy attempted to stabilize the country after decades of turmoil. Paris remained weary, but it was alive, and a powerful cultural movement was about to reshape its identity once more. The Renaissance arrived in France during the early 1500s, bringing with it new ideas about art, science, architecture, and human potential. One of the key figures responsible for introducing Renaissance culture into Paris was King Francis I, who ruled from 1515 to 1547. Francis admired the artistic achievements of Italy and wanted to bring that creativity into his own kingdom. He began transforming parts of the city, particularly the old fortress of the Louvre. Instead of simply maintaining it as a defensive structure, he ordered major renovations that turned it into a Renaissance palace. The change symbolized a broader shift in the city's identity. Paris was becoming a center not only of political power, but also of artistic innovation and intellectual life. Francis I also invited some of the greatest thinkers and artists of the era to France. Among them was Leonardo da Vinci, who spent the final years of his life under the king's patronage. Although Leonardo lived outside Paris, his presence reflected the cultural ambitions of the court. Art, architecture, and humanist philosophy flourished throughout the kingdom, and Paris benefited directly from this creative energy. Yet even as beauty and creativity expanded, deep tensions were forming within the country. By the middle of the 16th century, France was increasingly divided by religion. The Protestant Reformation had spread across Europe, and in France, many Protestants became known as Huguenots. Paris, however, remained strongly Catholic. Suspicion and hostility between the two groups grew steadily. These tensions finally exploded in one of the darkest episodes in the city's history. On August 24, 1572, violence erupted. During what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the initial target was a group of Protestant leaders gathered in Paris. But the killings quickly spread throughout the city. Catholic mobs hunted Protestants through the streets, breaking into homes. For several days, the violence continued. Bodies were thrown into the Seine River. Thousands of people were killed in Paris alone. The massacre left deep scars on the country and intensified the ongoing wars of religion that would continue for decades. Political instability soon added further chaos. In 1589, King Henry III was assassinated in Paris. His death created a succession crisis. Eventually, the throne passed to Henry IV, a Protestant nobleman who recognized that ruling a deeply Catholic nation would require compromise. According to tradition, Henry IV famously remarked that Paris is well worth a mass, referring to his decision to convert to Catholicism. In 1594, he entered Paris peacefully and began working to restore stability to the war-torn country. His reign marked the beginning of a slow healing process after decades of religious violence. A new era for Paris had begun. In the early 17th century, Henry IV transformed Paris with grand projects like the Pont Neuf, the city's oldest surviving bridge. He also created the Place des Vosges, the first planned square in Paris, reflecting a new vision of urban beauty and order. As the century progressed, Cardinal Richelieu centralized authority in the capital, focusing not just on politics but on language and culture. In 1635, he founded the Académie Française to standardize the French language, making Paris the heart of national identity. Then came Louis XIV, the Sun King, who turned the monarchy into a grand performance, using architecture to demonstrate absolute power. From the evolution of the Louvre to the construction of the Hôtel des Invalides, Paris became a monument to the crown. Yet, distrusting the city's rebellious energy, Louis XIV moved the royal court to Versailles in 1682, physically distancing himself from Paris. The palace became the main seat of power, allowing the king to control the nobility in a secluded, magnificent environment. Despite the king's absence, Paris flourished. Intellectual salons became the center of European thought and sophistication. By the end of the century, Paris had secured its reputation as the unrivaled cultural and intellectual heart of Europe. In the 18th century, Paris was the center of the world, a city of unparalleled refinement, fashion, and culture. But beneath the surface, a divide was growing between the luxury of the court and the economic struggle of ordinary citizens. This was the Age of Enlightenment, where radical new ideas about liberty and reason began to challenge absolute authority. Intellectuals sought to compile all human knowledge, believing that reason should guide society rather than tradition. Yet as the city grew, famine and debt pushed the people to their limits, literally burying the past in the catacombs beneath the streets. By the late 1780s, the tension reached a boiling point. The city of ideas was about to become the epicenter of revolution. Paris stood on the threshold of a new era, one that would change the course of human history forever. By the summer of 1789, tension in Paris had reached a level that could no longer be contained. Years of economic hardship, rising food prices, and resentment toward the monarchy had created a city filled with frustration. Bread had become dangerously expensive, and many families struggled just to survive from one day to the next. At the same time, the royal government appeared disconnected from the suffering of ordinary citizens. The contrast between the luxurious life of the aristocracy and the hunger of the population was becoming impossible to ignore. On July 14, 1789, that frustration finally exploded. Crowds of Parisians gathered and marched toward the Bastille. They marched toward a fortress that had long symbolized royal authority, the Bastille. Although the prison held only 7 inmates at the time, it represented something much larger: absolute power. When the crowd stormed the fortress, they were sending a message that the old order was being challenged. The fall of the Bastille quickly became the defining moment that signaled the beginning of the French Revolution. News of the event spread rapidly across the country, transforming Paris into the center of upheaval. The royal family was forced to leave Versailles and relocate to Paris, where they were kept under watch. Inside the Tuileries Palace, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. What followed was a decade of instability. In 1792, the monarchy was officially abolished, and France was declared a republic. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Concorde. Thousands gathered to witness the execution, marking a moment that shocked monarchies across Europe. The violence did not end there. 9 months later, Queen Marie Antoinette was also executed. Soon the revolution entered its most extreme phase, known as the Reign of Terror, led by Maximilien Robespierre. The government attempted to eliminate anyone suspected of opposing the revolution. Thousands were arrested. The guillotine became the symbol of this period. Nobles, priests, and rivals were all at risk. Fear spread throughout Paris as neighbors began suspecting one another of disloyalty. Streets once hosting markets now witnessed endless processions of prisoners being transported to execution. The terror eventually consumed its own leaders. In 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and executed. France was left exhausted, traumatized, and politically unstable, longing for stability after years of chaos. That stability would arrive in the form of an ambitious military leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, Napoleon seized power through a coup, becoming the dominant figure in France. Napoleon ruled with authority, but he also saw himself as a modernizer and builder of a grand nation. One of his most famous projects was the Arc de Triomphe, commissioned in 1806 to honor his victories. Its massive design reflected Napoleon's ambition to place Paris at the heart of a new European empire. He also ordered the construction of the Rue de Rivoli, a grand boulevard cutting through the center of the city. Napoleon also reformed the legal system with the Napoleonic Code, which influenced laws across Europe. His military campaigns across the continent brought enormous amounts of art and cultural treasures back to Paris. These collections were displayed in the Louvre, which Napoleon transformed into a public museum. The Louvre became not only a symbol of French culture, but also a powerful display of imperial authority. However, empires built through conquest rarely last forever. Napoleon's ambitions eventually led him into disastrous military campaigns. His invasion of Russia in 1812 proved catastrophic, with harsh weather and logistical failures destroying much of his army. European powers united against him, and in 1813 he suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Leipzig. By 1814, foreign armies had advanced toward Paris itself. Russian, Prussian, and Austrian forces entered the city, marking a humiliating moment for the empire that had once dominated Europe. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Although he briefly returned to power during the famous 100 Days in 1815, his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo ended his rule permanently. Napoleon was exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821. Paris was left to reflect on the legacy of his rule. The city had been the capital of an empire that reshaped Europe, but it had also experienced occupation and defeat. In the years that followed, the Bourbon monarchy was restored to power. Yet the people of Paris had not forgotten the revolutionary spirit that had once transformed their city. Political tensions remained high, and the desire for greater political representation continued growing among the population. In July 1830, frustration erupted once again. Parisians took to the streets and launched another uprising against King Charles VI. Barricades appeared across the city as citizens fought government forces in what became known as the July Revolution. After several days of intense fighting, the king was overthrown. A new ruler, Louis-Philippe, took the throne and presented himself as a citizen king, claiming to represent the interests of the people rather than absolute monarchy. But his government soon disappointed many who had hoped for deeper reforms. Economic inequality and political dissatisfaction continued growing. By February 1848, Paris exploded into revolution once more. Demonstrations turned violent, and Louis-Philippe fled the country. The Second Republic was declared, but political instability remained constant. Only months later, workers in Paris launched another uprising demanding social reforms and improved conditions for laborers. The government responded with brutal force. Thousands of protesters were killed during the suppression of the June Days uprising. Paris once again became a city divided against itself, filled with political conflict and social unrest. Out of this unstable environment emerged another powerful figure connected to the legacy of Napoleon. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the former emperor, was elected president in 1848. Many voters believed his famous family name represented strength and stability, but his ambitions extended far beyond the presidency. In 1851, he carried out a coup and soon declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations Paris had ever experienced. When Napoleon III declared himself emperor, Paris entered a period of dramatic transformation that would permanently reshape the city's appearance and structure. Although his rule was authoritarian, he believed that modernization could strengthen both the capital and the nation. To achieve this vision, he appointed a determined administrator named Baron Georges-Eugène Haussmann and gave him a task that seemed almost impossible: redesign Paris from the ground up. From 1853 to 1870, Haussmann carried out one of the most radical urban redevelopment projects in modern history. Much of medieval Paris still consisted of narrow, winding streets that were crowded and unsanitary. Entire neighborhoods were demolished for wide boulevards. New parks were created for public green spaces, and a modern sewer system improved sanitation, while elegant stone facades defined the city's style. The transformation also had a political purpose. Wide boulevards made it difficult for revolutionaries to build barricades during uprisings. However, these changes came at a cost. Many working-class neighborhoods were destroyed, forcing thousands of residents to the outskirts. In 1870, Napoleon III declared war on Prussia. The conflict turned against France, and the emperor himself was captured at the Battle of Sedan. The city endured a brutal 4-month siege. Food supplies ran dangerously low, forcing residents to eat whatever they could find to survive. In March 1871, radical citizens established the Paris Commune, aiming for a new system based on social equality and local democracy. Conflict soon turned violent during the Bloody Week in May. Between 10 and 20,000 people were killed in the fighting. In their final days, Communard fighters set fire to important buildings, including the Tuileries Palace, leaving Paris wounded by internal conflict. Yet from these ashes a new era emerged, the Belle Époque. From the 1870s until 1914, Paris became the global center of art and innovation. Impressionist painters like Monet and Degas revolutionized art, challenging conventions and capturing the fleeting beauty of modern life. Entertainment flourished with the opening of the Moulin Rouge in 1889, a symbol of Parisian nightlife and artistic experimentation. One of the most iconic symbols appeared in 1889, the Eiffel Tower, a powerful representation of modern engineering. The Paris Metro opened in 1900 with Art Nouveau entrances that made the city vibrant, modern, and internationally admired. Tensions across Europe erupted into World War I in 1914. Paris lived under constant threat, with German forces advancing dangerously close. The city famously used taxis to rush soldiers to the front lines, helping save the capital. For 4 years, Parisians endured air raids and shortages. Victory finally came in 1918. The 1920s followed with a revival of energy known as the Années Folles, or Crazy Years. Paris became a cultural hub for jazz, artists like Picasso, and writers like Hemingway. Fashion was revolutionized by icons like Coco Chanel, but the optimism would not last forever. The 1930s brought economic depression and rising extremism. By 1939, Paris faced its darkest chapter.